Hey, welcome to the To Be the Church podcast. Tyler here. And if you're watching on YouTube, on our new YouTube channel, thanks so much. If you're listening in your podcast app, I encourage you, check it out, youtube.com/To Be the Church. This podcast has turned video, and so we're excited about that. And we're also excited because we have a very special episode today. We talked to author and pastor Jared C. Wilson about his book, The Gospel-Driven Church, Uniting Church Growth Dreams with the Metrics of Grace. I found this book extremely helpful as a pastor, and then even in conversations with those around me, just even church members, really trying to dial in, like, am I gospel-driven? Truly, am I gospel-centered? The gospel is, as Tim Keller says, not just the ABCs of the Christian life, but it's the A to Z of Christianity. And so in this book and in this interview, we talk with Jared about both what it means to be gospel-driven and what a gospel-driven church truly looks like. So we're going to mention books in this episode. We're going to mention some Twitter accounts and stuff like that. The links for all that stuff can be found in the show notes or in the YouTube description. All right, let's get right to it. Yeah, so this is a really special treat for us here at the To Be the Church podcast to have Jared C. Wilson with us, because I'm trying to think, maybe John Piper might be the only author that we've mentioned or recommended more on this podcast over the years, over the 5 years we've been doing this show, than Jared. Jared co-wrote a book called The Explicit Gospel, which I've personally mentioned on this podcast probably more than any book. We talk a lot about the imperfect disciple, and today we're going to talk about his book that came out last year, I believe, called The Gospel-Driven Church. And Jared, thanks so much for being with us today.
Man, thanks for having me. I think if I'm second only to Piper in recommendations, y'all need to read some more. I think you need a wider diet in your in your reading. I think
that's probably true.
Yeah, it's flattering for sure, but man, yeah, you need to diversify a little bit.
So, are you joining us from Kansas City right now?
I am. I'm actually north of Kansas City. I live in a little town just north. But yeah, I'm in the KC Metro, as they say.
Okay,
yeah.
So I'm from the KC Metro. I'm out here in Vancouver, Washington now, but my whole family is from Overland Park. And so,
excellent.
Yeah,
okay.
we grew up, going to Chiefs and Royals games. And has Mahomes won you over yet?
No, I mean, I like him, but I'm not a Chiefs fan. And Overland Park, I mean, that's on the Kansas side, man. That's I'm on the Missouri side, so we have to have some kind of
there's a beef there,
sense of privilege and superiority over each other, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So you are the assistant professor of pastoral ministry at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, also the author in residence there.
That's correct.
And then you do a training program as well at Liberty Baptist Church, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's called the Pastoral Training Center. Mm-hmm.
Cool. What does that look like at a local church?
The residency?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an 18-month program. We have guys who are answering and discerning a call to vocational ministry, and so there's an assessment process, application process. It's not designed for guys, I'm not sure if I want to do this or not, but guys who are clearly following a call. And 18 months, we have a group meeting once a month all together. They read the same book every month. They read a different book every month, and have to write papers, but it's very spiritual formation based, actually. So there's a lot of one-on-one time with me. Discipleship is really the aim of the residency. They're learning more and developing more in practical skills and those sorts of things. But what we really try to emphasize are the biblical qualifications for the pastorate. All those things you find in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. That's really what we're trying to kind of help them develop more and more in over the course of 18 months. And they get lots of frontline hands-on experience in the life of the church, in the ministry of the church, pulpit reps. We do 2 preaching labs as well. So yeah, it's just a good kind of training ground for guys who are following the call to lead God's church.
That's awesome. That's really cool. So when I picked up the Gospel-Driven Church for the first time, I found myself very excited because I'm in a role where I oversee ministry staff and ministry team, and so I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out what metrics can we use to figure out if we're being effective in ministry or not. And so I stare at dashboards and I'm thinking through what are those metrics? And so we're going to talk about the metrics that you bring out in the book. But before we do, would you give us just a bit of your pastoral journey and what sparked the writing even of Gospel Driven Church?
Yeah, so it really is kind of the outgrowth of a big transition that I made in ministry philosophy about 10 years or so into being in, serving in the local church. So I, believe that the Lord called me into ministry when I was in junior high school, and knew just all through, late adolescence, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to serve in a local church. Now, of course, at that age, you don't really have a clear perception of what that entails and what that's supposed to look like. But I just knew and would tell my, the youth pastors that I had when I was a kid, I want to be a pastor. I want to be in ministry and look for, mentorship there. And the summer I graduated high school, I had my first ministry position. It was a student minister for a Chinese Baptist church that met in my church, the church that I kind of grew up in. And they went to our youth pastor and said, we're looking for a young man who might, be willing to direct our student ministry. And our youth pastor said, well, I got a guy, he needs an entry level ministry position. And I, hit the ground running the summer after my high school graduation. But I was sort of trained for ministry. My first kind of mentoring and even sort of my formative experience in church in those high school into early college years was basically in what we used to call the seeker church kind of model, the seeker sensitive church or seeker targeted church. And, I was trained to understand ecclesiology through that lens. And even just, the corporate gathering of the worship service and all those sorts of things. And, was completely, bought in, sold out on that. I would have been, in fact, an apologist for the seeker church, sort of model, and did ministry in that paradigm, again, for about 10 years or so. We eventually landed in Nashville, Tennessee, because of my wife's employment, and finished school there. We found ourselves at a large attractional church, kind of a Saddleback model sort of church in West Nashville, where I eventually began leading the young adult ministry there. But in the midst of that season, there was a season actually where I was serving in a lay capacity in that church, teaching new members classes, leading community groups, volunteering in the student ministry, doing some teaching, that sort of thing, where there just was a personal train wreck in my own life. It was really kind of the mess of my hidden sin was beginning to kind of explode through the surface of my life. I couldn't keep it hidden anymore. And my marriage was a mess. My life was a mess. I entered into a pretty profound season of depression, including, suicidal thoughts and that sort of thing. And I found myself in those days, I was living in the guest bedroom of our home. My wife and I essentially estranged, but living in the same house, and just begging God to do something to fix it. I didn't even know what to ask for. And, when you walk through a season like that, what St. John of the Cross calls the dark night of the soul, which is what I think I was in, where I just didn't even want to exist anymore. I was asking God to give me a reason not to kill myself or to do it for me, to just take me out. I felt hopeless, overwhelmed, cut off from everything that I thought I cared about and that I aspired to do. And I did this for about a year, just praying, going through the motions, living a weird kind of disjointed, crushed life, and walking in repentance from my sin, and yet still just feeling empty. And then one night while I was praying, the Lord, the only way I can describe is the Lord came down. It was as if he reached into, through the roof of that house, into that guest bedroom, grabbed a hold of me and spoke words to me into my heart. It wasn't an audible voice or any kind of miraculous vision or anything like that, but spoke into my heart words that I had heard before and words that I knew and I think that I had believed, but it was as if I had heard them for the first time. Since essentially, I love you and I approve of you in Christ. It was a reminder of the gospel, the thing that had saved me, had converted me years before. But it gave me this refreshment, this rejuvenation that I didn't think those who were already saved would find in the gospel. I grew up in a church culture where the implicit message was basically the gospel is for lost people. And then once you have it, you move on to other things. And that was the kind of mode that that I was discipled in, and certainly that I actually ministered in as well. The idea that the gospel would be for Christians just as much as it is for lost people, in a different way, but just as much for the growth of Christians, for their conforming to the image of Christ. That was a foreign concept until this night. And of course, I didn't have, fleshed out on my mind all of the ins and outs of gospel-centered, this or that. But it didn't come about for me through somebody handing me a book or going to a conference or reading the right blogs, listening to the right podcast. None of that really even existed. The so-called gospel-centered tribe wasn't quite a thing yet. And such as it was, I had no idea about it anyway. It was this bedroom experience where the lights came on for me. And the Lord began to work through that. My fixation on the finished work of Christ as a believer, I'm beginning to see the scriptures in a whole new way. It's refreshing me. I feel empowered in a different way. I feel healed in a very real way. The Lord began to reconcile me to my wife, stitched us back together slowly but surely, as I'm kind of working out the ins and outs of this gospel-centered thing, which I don't even know if I knew that phrase back then, but that's essentially what it was. The Lord began to open up these doors for ministry then, as if to say, okay, now that you've had your legs knocked out from under you, I'm going to, put you back out on the ice, Bambi, and see how you do. And so eventually we ended up planting a church. A few years into that, we went to Vermont, and the last sort of 15 years of ministry. So it's been about 15 years since that night. The last 15 years of church ministry for me has been a kind of, in a way, in the beginning, an unlearning of everything that I'd learned in the first decade, but now really kind of a pressing gospel centrality into every corner of the room, so to speak. And sometimes I like to describe it as I'm 15 years into a repentance tour for the first 10 years of my ministry. And that's where the book really came from, which is basically, how do you transition a church from an attractional paradigm, which entails things like pragmatism and consumerism and even kind of a light pseudo legalism, a kind of moralism. How do you take a church that is oriented that way and turn it, lead it in the process to become more and more gospel-centered? And so the book, The Gospel-Driven Church, comes out of my experiences, first of all, in kind of that personal transition, and then just the ministry shift myself. And then as I've seen it work out in numerous churches, either that I have led or that I have, consulted with others about or learned from various friends.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that story. That's wild. There's this juxtaposition between the pragmatic attractional church model and the gospel-driven church. I was at a conference here in Portland it was kind of discussing the online church model. This was right before COVID hit, so it was very odd timing. But essentially, it was a bunch of seminary students who were taking this as a class, and a bunch of seminary students, and then it was held at a very pragmatic attractional megachurch here in town that kind of holds those values. And just watching those two worlds interact, I mean, it was like I needed popcorn, because it was quite fun watching seminary students, kind of interact in that attractional world. But what would you say, in the book you call them marks of neutrality, things that could be good, could be bad. Like what are those metrics that you see the attractional world, like what's king there, if you will?
The top one in the attractional world is essentially attendance or numbers. How many people are coming on the weekend to your weekend services and that sort of thing. That's the number one thing, and it becomes a justifier in and of itself of faithfulness, or an apologetic for faithfulness. That's the measurement of success. We obviously aren't doing anything wrong, or we must be doing something right, because people are coming and they continue to come, and we are growing numerically. And now I call that a neutral sign because it's not for us to turn and go, well, that's, that's a bad thing.
Right.
Every good pastor wants his church to grow. And in fact, sometimes I'm cautious about the pastor who thinks that his shrinking church or his plateaued church is a sign of his faithfulness. We must be preaching the truth because people aren't showing up, sort of thing. And when really that could just be because you're not actually reaching the lost, because you're kind of a jerk. There could be lots of reasons why you're not growing. So it's a neutral sign in that it tells us something, and it probably tells us something, even important, but it doesn't tell us the most important thing. It's not the most revealing thing about your church, because there are lots of churches that do not preach the gospel, including outside the Christian tradition. Right. We wouldn't say that a Roman Catholic church that is accumulating numbers, or a Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall that's reaching lots of people. We wouldn't say that just because they're growing numerically, they must be onto something. They must be doing something right or theologically right. So that's one of the neutral signs. The other, of course, is just budgetarily, as things increase in your giving, things that you can kind of count on your hand. But even some intangible things, right? So the idea of, feedback, or what we might call today, the vibe, that there's a spirit of excitement or something like that. Those can be good things, but they're still neutral signs. We certainly prefer a spirit of excitement in our church to a spirit of disappointment or discouragement in our church. But just because people are excited or they seem happy doesn't itself justify what we are doing. It's a neutral sign. It tells us something, but it doesn't tell us everything.
Yeah. In the book, you say this, and I know it's kind of weird to read your own book back to you, but I'm doing it for the sake of our listeners here. It says, seeing people make professions of faith tells you something. Seeing an increase in attendance tells you something. And seeing people respond emotionally to the worship service tells you something. But there are many ways to increase those numbers, not all of them biblical. You don't need Jesus to see these happen. Whenever these metrics are king, if you will, and like they kind of drive everything, what happens in the people of that church? Like what, thinking about the formation of the week in and week out ministry, what is formed in people when those metrics drive all decisions?
Well, I think what's formed partly, or at least ultimately, is that they can begin to see themselves as simply data points in somebody's religious project, or in some sort of production of spiritual goods and services, where the soul is not as important as the body, or the presence of the body. So you can just begin to feel like you're a customer in kind of a consumeristic enterprise. But spiritually, something can happen actually when we're only measuring sort of external things in our discipleship, in our spiritual journeys. If I'm only measuring, okay, I read X number of Bible verses today, I went to church, 7 out of the 8 weeks, so in the last couple of months or whatever, so I have all these external things of behavioral compliance or behavioral expectations. Those are, again, good things. Those aren't bad things. We should be reading the Bible more. We should be, attending the church gathering, all those sorts of things. But if that is where my measure of success is, it almost doesn't matter what's happening inside, right? The scriptures don't hold out for us just these behavioral or these outward metrics for spiritual growth. Paul holds out in Galatians 5 the fruit of the Spirit, things that are less external. They're manifested externally, but things that begin on the inside, that we would be peaceable, that would be good and gentle and kind and self-controlled. Those are things that are much harder to measure and require a kind of a deeper work than simply managing our religious behavior. So, even spiritually speaking, theologically speaking, what it can do to people is create a kind of form of works righteousness that is really deceptive and kind of subtle, because in most of these churches, if not all of them, there is at least an implicit understanding that we're more positive than those traditional judgmental people. In fact, the idea that they would be espousing any kind of works salvation or legalism, so to speak, would be, would seem ludicrous, because in our minds, in their minds, legalism looks like a Pharisee, or looks like somebody who is very stern and is focused on the negative side of the law. But being positive about the law, giving people a steady set of things to do as the center of your message, isn't any less legalistic than giving people don'ts as the center of your message. Even if you dress casual and have a band on stage and use the fog and the lasers and all that sort of thing, you can dress it up so it doesn't look traditional or pharisaical or institutional, but the due kind of moralistic message is still just as legalistic. And so what we can end up creating inadvertently is a kind of self-righteousness in our discipleship of people that's just as dangerous, if not more so, because we tend to recoil at judgmental, stern, mean people, just naturally. But we are drawn to people who are positive, who are upbeat, who seem encouraging. And so that kind of legalism can actually be even more deceptive, because we don't, it kind of sneaks up on us a little bit more.
Yeah. So if a pastor or church leader is listening to this and they're thinking, kind of like I was when I was reading this book, like, man, that's not what I want to create in my people. Like, I want people who are truly gospel-centered, who are being discipled, who are growing in their faith. And as I was reading this, I found myself like thinking like, all right, sweet. Like, Jared's going to give me some metrics here that I can actually, hold on to figure out, like, are we creating that in people? And so you have 5 metrics in the book, and I'll just read them here: a growing esteem for Jesus Christ, a discernible spirit of repentance, a dogged devotion to God's word, an interest in theology and doctrine, and an evident love for God and neighbor. And in the book, you kind of flesh out, like what those look like. But even at that point in the book, I found myself like nodding my head and being like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. How in the world do I measure that? And so what would you say to a pastor who's sitting in front of you saying that?
Yeah, well, I would say that you probably can't, at least not in the way that you're used to measuring. You almost have to even reevaluate your ability to appraise these things. And that's where really, I mean, the importance of discernment comes in. And for the leaders of a church, for the elders of a church, real, pastoral care, having oversight over your people and good relationships with the people, or at least the structures through which to measure these things, because these things are best measured in community. So obviously, especially once a church hits, say, 50 people, it's impossible for the pastor or even a group of pastors, as the church grows, to know every single person in the whole church and know everything that's going on in their lives. And yet having a structure of relationality and pastoral oversight could include things like having community groups where members are involved and there's some sort of check-in with the community group member. But those people who have direct oversight, direct relationships, are able to see into our life over time and to say, hey, I actually am beginning to see these evidences of grace in your life. Sometimes we just think about the accountability that these sort of environments provide for us, that we have other brothers and sisters who are doing life with us, who can see our sin and can see our failures and those sorts of things. And that's important and good. But gosh, what a great gift it is to have brothers and sisters who can say, you actually have grown a whole lot in being peaceable. You aren't as argumentative as you seemed to be 2 years ago, or something like that. To see these evidences of growth that sometimes we can't see in ourselves. So how we measure them is really a matter of discernment, of good pastoral perception, and that really involves that there are that there's real, meaningful, effective member care, pastoral care taking place in a church community.
Yeah, man, that's great. I think you mentioned in the book some of the questions you can ask to start getting your mind around some of these metrics, and some of them were frankly like rather convicting. Here at our church, we talk a lot about the number of people we've baptized over the last decade. Our lead pastor's been here a decade, so we talk a lot about that number. But one of the numbers that you bring out here is like, what about the baptisms who are still walking in the faith? 5-10 years later, it's like, oh man, I need to figure that out. I need to, as a pastor, I need to do that. Another one was, what does the community around the church say about you? And I think a lot of them would say, oh yeah, that's the church next to Costco. And that would be kind of where it ends. And so I don't know, even as I'm thinking through this, like it was convicting for me just to be like, all right, like how does an evident love for, I think we have a very evident love for God in our church. How does the love for neighbor, play out? And, that's so yeah, really great stuff. So let's turn the conversation a bit, because a lot of this book is pointed toward church leaders, right?
Yeah.
And church leaders there. But what would you say to the church member who's listening to this podcast right now, or maybe reading the book and thinking, okay, how do I discern if my church is gospel driven?
Yeah, well, it's similar kind of things to observe as a leader might. And the main point is what is the vision being portrayed in the content delivery. So the primary point of content delivery, of course, is the weekend service sermon. Over time, what is the through line to all of those messages? We may be in different texts, we may have different topics, but could I say that the main point of every message, no matter the text or the topic, the main point is somehow the finished work of Christ? Am I being shown the glory of Jesus? That's probably the primary way you would discern that. But I think even the kind of songs we sing, gosh, we sing a whole lot of songs that have a lot to do about us and how we feel. And those things are okay. There's lots of how we feel in the Psalms, for instance, so it's a biblical thing. But if the major kind of tone of the songs is more about an experience or about feeling, that's telling us something as well. And if it's not about rehearsing the gospel as a consistent theme, then we can see, okay, it's the music is somehow gospel uncensored. I think asking questions like you just brought up about sort of the missional posture. Are the people of my church, am I, and are my brothers and sisters at least working through the impetus to evangelize? Are we, sort of together trying to encourage each other and working through what it might mean to reach our lost, friends and neighbors? And is the church itself corporately, are they directing us in a missional posture together? Does our church have kind of a hand outstretched to those outside the walls, or do we just sort of expect that everything will take place in-house and we've lost the kind of go and tell for a come and see kind of approach? So those are the main things. It's not radically different from what a leader might look at to sort of observe, and is this a gospel centered church or a gospel driven church or not? The member would be, I think, looking at similar, or if not the same things.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful. Jared, thank you so much for not only writing this book, but also being willing to sit with us for a minute and chat about it. If our listeners want to follow your work, where's the best place they can do that?
You can find everything about me at jaredcwilson.com. I'm on social media, but all the links to that stuff is there. All the links to my books are there. And this is coming out next week, you said?
Yeah.
So can I mention I have a new book that came out last week? It's brand new. So when you watch this or hear this, it'll be 2 weeks old. It's called Gospel Driven Ministry, and it's sort of a prequel to Gospel Driven Church, the book we were just talking about. But it's more about, for those called to ministry, kind of all the ins and outs, the kitchen sink approach to what a pastoral ministry centered on the finished work of Christ might look like. So I go through preaching, counseling, negotiating conflict, all sorts of things related to pastoral ministry, including the last chapter on helping people die well, and the pastor himself actually preparing to die well. So I appreciate you letting me get that plug in there.
Dude, no, that's awesome. I look forward to reading that, and we might have to have another conversation with you after.
Okay, yeah.
After we do that. Well,
Rain
again,
check.
yeah, man, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. We'll put all the links to Jared's website, to the books, this book and the book just mentioned, and he's a good Twitter follow too. So we'll put the link there in the show notes, both on YouTube and on your podcast app. So, Jared, thanks again, man.
Thank you, brother.
So if you have any questions or comments about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. Most of our episodes that aren't interviews are literally just answering and responding to the questions that you send in. So feel free to do that. podcast@toBeTheChurch.com is the best place for that. You can also do it in the YouTube comments or on social media @toBeTheChurch. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.